Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we are in St-Nicolas de Bourgueil and we're looking at the Domaine Amirault 2019 Les Gravilices, Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil. The domaine was established in the 1830s by Octave Amirault when he acquired his first few parcels of vines in Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil. Today the domaine is being run by Xavier Amirault and his wife Agnès. They're farming around 34 hectares of vineyards, predominantly in Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil, with a few recently acquired parcels in Bourgueil. Their vineyards have been farmed certified organic since 2008, and they received their biodynamic certification in 2011. The domaine makes a wide range of Cabernet Francs, with some cuvées employing the philosophy of assemblage or blending, like Les Gravilices, while others are cuvées parcellaires, that is to say that the fruit is coming from a single lieu-dit or a single vineyard. Now, many reference materials will lump the appellations of Bourgueil and Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil together in terms of their terroirs. And from a bird's eye view, there are a lot of similarities between these two appellations. But, of course, the beauty here is in the details. So the appellation of Bourgueil stretches about 15 kilometers from east to west across 7 communes. And it's comprised of a wide diversity of vineyard aspects, elevations, microclimates, and soils. Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil, on the other hand, is a little bit easier to define. It encompasses one village, Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil. And this village starts at the western border of the Bourgueil commune and stretches west about 6 kilometers. And there's a few key things to note about the viticultural area and the soils in this appellation. First and foremost, the position of Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil along the Loire River, as the Loire River takes a bit of a dogleg northwest towards Saumur, means that the appellation as a whole has a bit more of a south-southwest exposure. In addition to this, because of its proximity to the opening of the Vienne River tributary, these two factors combined means that Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil is a little bit warmer than Bourgueil as a whole, so much so that harvest in Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil will often happen upwards to 10 days ahead of that in Bourgueil. Now, also, because of how the Loire changes course ever so slightly here at Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil, the ancient alluvial terrace that begins in Restigné and stretches all the way across the Bourgueil appellation actually then begins to get a bit wider here in Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil. So much so, in fact, that 65% of the vineyard area in the appellation is on this ancient alluvial terrace. And as the ancient alluvial terrace widens, the vineyard area that is on the recent alluvial soils, which is closest to the Loire River, and the area of vineyards that are on the côte or the slopes where we find the tuffeau-derived soils, these two areas will narrow quite a bit. Today's wine is coming from vineyards on the ancient alluvial terrace, and because of the fact that this ancient alluvial terrace is 65% of the vineyard area in the appellation, it's worth taking a moment to note some of the key elements of this particular part of the appellation. So the ancient alluvial terrace stretches about 1.5 to 2.5 kilometers from north to south, and it spans the entire width of the appellation. The terrace is at its narrowest point in the eastern part of the appellation, and it gets progressively wider as we move west. And to the naked eye, the ancient alluvial terrace appears flat, but it is on a very long and gradual slope from north to south, with the elevations at the bottom of the terrace at around 40 meters above sea level, rising to about 55 meters above sea level at the top of the ancient alluvial terrace. Now, in terms of soils, the ancient alluvial terrace can loosely be divided into 3 main areas. Now, across the board, I should say, however, there are some commonalities. So we're dealing with very deep soils here, and the topsoil texture across the board is mostly sand. But where things start to get interesting is when we look at the stoniness of the soil as well as the subsoil, so what we find underneath that sandy topsoil. So in the southern part of the ancient alluvial terrace, there is this narrow band of vineyards that is flanked on either side of the route D35. And this is where we find very stony or gravelly soils, anywhere from 50 to 100% stones or gravels in this particular part. In addition to that, the subsoil is also gravels. So these two elements combined really influence the viticulture in this particular part of the ancient alluvial terrace. So these soils, they will be very free draining. Water reserves will be a little bit on the lower side, which means that depending on the age of the vines, these vineyards can actually suffer from a little bit of hydric stress in drier years. These soils as well are warmer, and that means that bud break tends to be a little bit earlier than average here. Then we have the middle part of the ancient alluvial terrace, which is this wide swath of land that stretches about 1 kilometer from north to south. And this area has virtually no stones. So we're dealing with mostly sand here in terms of the topsoil. And then the subsoil is a deep hydromorphic sand. So viticulturally speaking, this area, the soils are a little bit less free draining. We have a bit more water holding capacity in the soils, and this means that yields may be a little bit higher here. Vigor can also be a little bit higher in this area. These soils are also a little bit cooler, so bud break will be normal or perhaps even a little bit later than normal. Finally, we have a narrow band of vineyards at the top of the ancient alluvial terrace. This is right at the base of the slopes. And this narrow band of vineyards is a little bit more stony again, but not nearly as stony as what we find at the southern part of the ancient alluvial terrace. And then in terms of subsoil, we'll find either this hydromorphic sand or we'll find gravels depending on where we are. So this narrow band at the top of the terrace will be somewhere in the middle from a viticultural standpoint in terms of drainage and access to water and yield and potential vigor, as well as precocity, etc. And I know all of this seems like a bit of minutiae in terms of the level of detail here, but it's important because all of these factors in terms of these soils will influence viticulture. It will influence the quality of the fruit, the quantity of fruit that's coming from these vineyards, and that will inevitably influence how the vineyard chooses to work with this fruit in the cellar in terms of winemaking techniques, and that will inevitably influence what we experience in the glass. Now, today's wine is coming from, as the name Les Gravilices suggests, this is coming from those very gravelly soils in the southernmost part of the ancient alluvial terrace. So it's coming from about 3.7 hectares worth of vines from several lieux-dits that are along this narrow stretch of vineyards at the base of the ancient alluvial terrace. And the vines are on average around 35 to 40 years of age. Also, there is a small portion of fruit that is coming from some very old Cabernet Sauvignon vines that make their way into this cuvée as well. From a winemaking perspective, the fruit for this wine is hand harvested, hand sorted, and it is all destemmed. And the fermentation is in 45 hectoliter wooden vats. And the fermentation is done with indigenous yeast, and the fermentation temperature is maintained at a slightly cooler temperature, around 22 degrees Celsius. In terms of maceration, Xavier and his team, they'll come in and they'll do some very light pump overs just once a day during the fermentation, just to ensure that the cap stays wet. The total time on skins is about 21 days as well. And then in terms of the post-fermentation maceration and the approach with pressing, this is very similar to what we would see for white wines. So they'll drain off the free-run wine, and then they'll make several cuts of the press wine, and they'll incorporate the heart of the press wine in with the free-run wine, and that is sort of the final assemblage for this cuvée. That is then aged again in those 45 hectoliter wooden vats for about 16 months. And then, excuse me, they will go ahead and bottle the wine and then age the wine in bottle for about 6 months or so before the wine is then released. So let's see what this wine is giving us today. So in terms of the nose, I'm getting a mix of red, but mostly a little bit darker fruit here. There's some red cherry, there's some darker black cherry as well. There's a bit of raspberry here, a bit of black currant. Has a slightly brambly edge to the fruit profile as well. And in terms of the pyrazines, it leans a bit more on that savory herbal side, which I love. And I love the profile here. It's a mix of sturdy as well as some soft herbs. So there's thyme, there's a bit of sage here as well. There's a cedar element. There's a bit of like a black currant leaf thing going on here as well. Even a bit of boxwood, which is kind of interesting. But in general, the nose has beautiful purity. It's clean, it's very fresh, it's very inviting. On the palate, those same darker fruits come through as they did on the nose. The savoriness is there as well. That little bit of a cedar boxwood thing is happening on the palate, which I like. Palate has a nice spice profile as well. Comes through a bit more subtly than what the nose might suggest. The nose has a bit of a spicy tinge, but the palate, the spice is really nice. It's a bit of like a nutmeg note, which is kind of interesting. There's a bit of a floral element to the palate as well, but not so intense. And then there is like a bit of a mineral graphite pencil shaving thing as well going on the palate, which I really like. The acidity is vibrant, really lively. It's really mouth-watering as well. I just want to like dive into some food here with this wine. And then in terms of the tannins, I think the tannins are really defining the texture of this wine and the overall profile of this wine. Very silky in the mouth. The tannins are finely woven, like I can almost visualize kind of a crosswork pattern with the tannins, which is kind of cool. And the tannins have a firm edge to them. There is a certain tautness to the tannins, if tautness is even a word, but I do like the tannin texture. The tannins also, or the mouthfeel as a whole, I should say, sits more broadly on the palate as opposed to something that is a bit more linear, which is interesting. And the tannins have a bit of a texture that's reminiscent of like a fine linen. So as I said, this wine sits a bit more broadly on the palate, and the tannins have a certain weave and knit to them, which I think is really in balance with how the fruit is coming through. There's a juiciness to the fruit, and the way the fruit is enveloping that tannin structure is really, really lovely. There's a nice middle palate experience here, which I think they did really well. They nailed that. So there's this nice supple middle palate thing going on. But there is some nice structure here. You know, there's a good acid backbone, and there is some weight and concentration to this wine as well. And it's interesting because we often think of the ancient alluvial soils in this appellation as giving wines that have a bit more early drinking appeal, which this wine certainly does. But, you know, I'm thinking about these types of soils we have here and the approach to fermentation, and this wine has some structure. It has concentration. There's weight here. And this is a wine that I think will improve with a little bit of time in the bottle. You know, perhaps not, you know, forever and ever and ever, but I think in the medium term, this wine is going to become something a little bit more interesting than what it is now. We'll start to see some of those tertiary layers together. That tannin structure will soften a little bit and become a little bit easier. And I think there's something really special going on in this wine, which will get better with a bit of age. The wine as a whole, it's classic, it's refined, it's balanced, and it's really delicious. And you can derive a lot of pleasure from this wine in its current state. But like I said, I think it has somewhere to go. Kind of cool too, which is nice. And I'm a big fan, I gotta say, of the wines from Xavier and Agnès Amirault. I visited them last spring and I had a wonderful time. And if you're in the area, they actually have a really fabulous, you know, tourism set up at the Domaine as well. So I would encourage you to visit the estate and check out their wines and learn a little bit more about their story and what they're doing in St-Nicolas de Bourgueil, because they really are one of the leading domains in the appellation. If you have a favorite wine from Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil, let me know who the producer is and what the wine is in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.